On April 25, 1945, the skies over Europe were heavy with a tension both strange and oppressive. The war, which had raged for over 6 years, was finally nearing its end, yet the silence among brigade commanders and Allied headquarters was heavier than any artillery fire or bombing they had ever heard. Berlin was under siege, streets clogged with fleeing German soldiers, and Hitler hid in his bunker like a wounded animal, trembling in anticipation of the apocalypse. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, preparing for an era of peace they believed was imminent. But in the American command office in Czechoslovakia, one man did not share in that sense of relief. General George S. Patton, the most decorated commander in U.S. military history, who had traversed the fiercest battlefields of Europe, could not rejoice. His heart did not dance to the rhythm of victory fireworks, but pounded in fear, a fear not of a defeated enemy, but of what was about to unfold. On the expansive command table, a map of Europe spread out like a continent awaiting its fate. Rain tapped against the windows, adding a grim rhythm to the gloomy afternoon. Patton stood before the map, hand resting on arrows and red dots indicating the advance of the Soviet Red Army, his eyes narrowing, lips pressed tight. Each movement of the Red Army on the map seemed to etch a cold prophecy into his mind. The real war had only just begun. In the weeks prior, Patton had closely monitored the Red Army's progress across Eastern Europe. Unlike the reports from Washington or Allied generals, what Patton saw with his own eyes was starkly different. Not liberators, as propaganda claimed, but occupiers, consuming every town, village, and city. Streets were deserted, women wept, men vanished into the night, factories dismantled and transported away. He understood that every step of the Red Army was not to bring peace, but to establish a new empire. Patton turned to the officers standing around him. They were silent, taken aback by the gravity on his face. "We have fought the wrong enemy," he said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "And if we do not stop them now, all of Europe will pay for our decisions for decades to come." No one needed to ask. They understood he was not speaking lightly. Patton had lived and died on battlefields, calculating every possibility to survive and triumph. When he predicted something, it was not conjecture, it was the conclusion of a razor-sharp strategic mind. In Patton's mind, the image of America and Europe asleep, blindly trusting in easy peace, mingled with anger and frustration. He saw Western leaders raising glasses in celebration, while Stalin's strategic moves, he whom they still regarded as an ally, were shaping a new continent under Soviet control. Every report, every piece of intelligence he read reinforced one realization. Stalin had not come to sign a peace agreement. He had come to take everything he could. Patton saw not only the Red Army, but the intent behind its actions. They were not weary, not confused, but always purposeful, expanding territory, consolidating power, creating an unbreakable barrier between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Patton understood that this was not a temporary enemy, but a long-term adversary, more dangerous than any he had faced in North Africa, Sicily, or Normandy. He paced the office, hand tracing the map, pointing to red arrows advancing through Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. Each Red Army advance, to him, represented an irreversible loss, a portion of Europe's future the West was surrendering without a fight. "If we do not act now," Patton whispered to the officers, "we will have to fight them later, but on their ground, at double the cost, double the lives lost." In that moment, the entire command room was silent. No gunfire, no artillery, only the rain tapping against the windows and Patton's racing heartbeat. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy, a prelude to a storm yet to come. Patton knew he stood at a historic moment, a moment that, if ignored, would yield consequences beyond human calculation. Even seeing all the signs, Patton knew other political and military leaders would not want to listen. They had just endured a brutal war, lost too many lives, and only wanted temporary peace. He understood voicing what he saw would be deemed extreme, even insane. Yet in his heart, silence was a crime. If he did not warn them, millions of lives would pay the price. That afternoon, Patton sat at the table, his gaze fixed on the red arrows on the map. Every town, every river, every border the Red Army crossed was a reminder the war was not over. It had only changed form. And he was the first, and almost the only one, to see what the world did not want to see. The real enemy was not the defeated Nazis, but a new empire rising, ready to impose its will over all of Europe. Night fell, yet Patton remained before the map, hand over the land he believed would become the Soviet-occupied zone. Rain tapped against the windows, the dim light from the desk lamp casting shadows over his stern face. No one else was around, just him and the vast map, with a weighty feeling. This fateful day would alter Europe not only for this year, but for the next half-century. Patton knew his warning would be forgotten, dismissed as the anger of a rebellious general. But in his heart, that did not matter. What mattered was that he had seen the future, and he had to do everything to sound the alarm, even if the world would not listen. April 25, 1945, was not just a day marking the end of war. It was the day Patton realized that the real battle had never truly ended. As the war in Western Europe neared its end, Patton began to realize something most Western leaders refused to acknowledge. The Soviet Red Army had not come to liberate, but to occupy. Weeks of observation, intelligence reports he read, combined with what he saw with his own eyes, left him horrified. Every step of their advance followed the same pattern: devastation, oppression, and annexation. In Poland, once bustling villages were now empty. People had fled or disappeared. Women, according to American soldiers' accounts, were subjected to mass rapes. Local anti-communist leaders were arrested, tortured, or executed. Factories, machinery, engines, even essential buildings were dismantled and transported to the Soviet Union. Patton did not only read the reports, he witnessed it firsthand during inspections of territories newly seized by the Red Army. In Czechoslovakia and the Czech lands, a similar scene unfolded. Small towns were reduced to rubble, streets that had once thrived lay silent, windows shattered, and empty walls seemed to scream. Remaining citizens were silent, fearful, watching Soviet convoys carry off goods and spoils. Patton walked those streets, hand trembling as he held his map, eyes scanning each abandoned house, each torn-apart family. He understood immediately this was not liberation, but systematic occupation. He summoned his senior officers to the office, the yellow light casting solemn shadows over their faces. On the map, he pointed to the red arrows advancing westward. "They will not stop at Berlin," Patton said, his voice cold and precise, "and they will stop nowhere else. Every kilometer they take is a portion of Europe's future we are giving away." No one interrupted. Everyone understood he was not exaggerating. He had commanded tens of thousands of men, defeated the toughest enemies, and when he spoke, it was the result of careful observation, analysis, and calculation. Patton had tracked the Red Army's behavior over the past weeks. Everywhere they went, the pattern repeated: suppression of civilians, elimination of political dissent, theft of property, arrests or killings of those who opposed them. There was no doubt, Stalin had not come to sign a peace treaty or bring democracy. He had come to build a new empire on fear and violence. Patton felt a deep fear. He had faced enemies he knew how to defeat, but this was an entirely different adversary, cunning, patient, and ambitious.
The brutality he observed was not merely warfare, it was a systematic preparation for a new world in which the Soviet Union would be the absolute power. One day, while inspecting a town near the Czechoslovakian border with a group of American officers, Patton witnessed a scene he would never forget. Soviet trucks carrying away everything remaining from a small factory, local men summoned to labor camps, women crying, children hiding in fear. He stopped, placing a hand on a young officer's shoulder, his voice low. They are not liberating, they are occupying, and if we do not stop them now, all of Europe will live under this rule for decades. Intelligence Patton gathered from frontline units confirmed what he had seen. Thousands of reports described Red Army torture, arrests, and looting. From Poland to Czechoslovakia, Romania to Hungary, the pattern was identical. Anything not theirs was seized, any resistance crushed. Patton understood this was not isolated behavior, but a deliberate strategy, directed personally by Stalin. In confidential meetings, Patton candidly presented his observations to senior officers. "We are mistaken about our ally," he said, his voice firm though trembling slightly. "They are not friends. They never have been. Every step they take consolidates power. If we do not stop them now, they will never stop." No one objected. All recognized the seriousness. But seeing was not enough. Patton knew the political world in the U.S. and the West was not ready to act. Leaders from Eisenhower to Roosevelt and Churchill still believed diplomacy would secure peace. But Patton saw the truth they refused to accept. While they raised glasses to celebrate victory, the Red Army was laying the foundation for an empire that would last decades, imposing totalitarian rule and fear on millions. One night, after returning to headquarters, Patton sat at his desk, surrounded by reports, photographs, and maps of Eastern Europe. His hand shook as he held his pen, tracing red arrows westward, pausing to take a deep breath. He knew that each day the West delayed action was another day the Red Army consolidated power, and the only chance to stop them was closing fast. In Patton's mind, images of abandoned towns, dismantled factories, and oppressed people replayed continuously. He realized he was witnessing the formation of an empire whose consequences would surpass the recent war. There was no doubt, if the U.S. and its allies did not intervene, Europe would pay with tens of millions of lives, enduring decades of domination. That day, as officers left the meeting room, Patton stood alone before the map. Rain tapped against the window, light from the lamp illuminating the vast chart. In that silent moment, he knew the war had not ended, it had only changed form. A new enemy, smarter and more patient, was making its final moves on Europe's chessboard, while the rest of the world blindly celebrated victory. Patton held the map, hand trembling, but eyes resolute. He knew what he saw would not be heeded. He knew Western leaders were choosing political comfort over confronting reality. But silence, in his mind, was not an option. He had to warn. He had to act, even if the whole world turned its back. April 25, 1945, ended with Patton standing before the map, rain falling outside, and a chilling awareness creeping through him. This was a fateful day, the day he realized the real war had never ended, and the Red Soviet Army was not an ally, but a new enemy waiting to seize Europe. On April 27, 1945, Patton's headquarters in Czechoslovakia was strangely quiet. Outside, rain fell in light streaks across the windows, casting faint reflections over the sprawling map of Europe on the table. Everyone assumed the war was nearing its end, that the Red Army's advance was merely a reward for the Allies' victory. But Patton, with more than 3 decades of combat experience, knew the reality was entirely different. 2 days earlier, he had sent an urgent cable to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, reporting what he had observed on the Eastern Front. The Red Army was not stopping at Berlin. They were continuing westward, seizing every city and strategic area, establishing control over territories that had once belonged to Germany and Eastern Europe. He wrote bluntly, without evasion, "We either withdraw to the agreed occupation zones or we strike the Soviet Union immediately. There is no third option." Patton understood that this message would be shocking. He knew politics dominated military decision-making. Eisenhower's mission was to maintain peace and stability and avoid any action that might provoke the Soviets at the very moment the war had just ended. But for Patton, Western hesitation was a disaster. With every passing hour, the Red Army consolidated power, and the only chance to push them back to the borders was slipping away. He summoned senior officers to the meeting room. The space was silent, broken only by the rustle of papers and the rapid heartbeat of those present. Patton opened the map, pointing to the red arrows advancing through Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. "We are handing the entire continent to Stalin without a fight," he said, voice sharp but trembling. "Every kilometer the Red Army takes is a portion of the future we are surrendering permanently." The officers exchanged glances, knowing Patton was not exaggerating. He had faced the most dangerous enemies, calculated every possible scenario for victory. When Patton warned, it was not idle talk, it was the conclusion of observation, evidence, and strategic analysis. He looked each man in the eye, emphasizing every word. "If we do not act now, we will have to fight them later, on their ground, at double the cost, double the lives lost." Shortly afterwards, Patton was granted a direct meeting with Eisenhower. It took place in a small villa in Germany, overlooking a calm river. A scene seemingly peaceful, yet the tension inside was thick as a ticking bomb. Patton approached the map first, his hand tracing the red arrows representing the Red Army. When Eisenhower entered, he nodded politely, his expression serious but not agreeing. Patton spoke firmly, "Ike, we need to talk about the Russians." Eisenhower exhaled, trying to maintain calm. "George, we've discussed this already." Patton would not be silenced. He pointed to Eastern Europe. "We are handing this continent over without a fight. Stalin is replacing the Nazis with a red dictatorship, different flag, same oppressive power. If we do not stop them now, millions will suffer for decades." Eisenhower tried to reason politically. "We have lost too many already, George. Americans want their children home. Diplomacy must come before military action. We cannot start a new war immediately after this one ends." Patton shook his head, eyes flashing with strategic fire. "Ike, you don't see. They are tired, exhausted. They can be pushed back now. Wait a year, and they will be stronger. Then it will be a true nightmare." The tension in the room was palpable. Patton stepped closer to the map, pressing on each territory occupied by the Red Army. "If we miss this opportunity, your children's generation will live in a divided Europe, under a regime they did not choose. We will regret it for life." Eisenhower remained calm, but his face was no longer at ease. He repeated, "We cannot start a new war. Containment is the most viable option. We must trust diplomacy." Patton sighed, lowering his voice but filling it with authority. "Containment does not work on predators. You cannot restrain a wolf with words. You must confront it when it is hungry and exhausted, not when it is ready to attack." The meeting ended, but in Patton's mind he knew the window of opportunity had closed. Eisenhower had made the final decision: no military action, ceding the captured territories to the Soviet Union, relying on diplomacy and political agreements. Patton left the villa in silence, eyes on the road ahead, but in his mind it was not Germany or the recently liberated cities that concerned him. It was the next 50 years of Europe, where fear and oppression were already taking root. Back at headquarters, Patton immediately drafted a new urgent cable to Eisenhower, the strongest, most direct one yet. "We must act now, or accept a Soviet-dominated era across all Eastern Europe. There is no third option. He signed and sent it with a sense of urgency only a seasoned warrior could understand. But Eisenhower's response was cold refusal. "The war is over, George. We are not starting a new one." Patton read each word, a surge of anger, frustration, and helplessness filling him. He crumpled the letter in his hands, muttering, "The greatest mistake in history is happening, and no one wants to see it." In the following days, Patton continued to monitor the Red Army's westward advance. Every new report, every image from the front only deepened his concern. They were no longer temporary allies. They were an occupying force with unlimited ambition, and the West remained silent, trusting in easy peace, while ignoring the reality before their eyes. In Patton's mind, everything was clear. The world had entered a new phase of war, not with resounding guns, but political, ideological, and power struggles, where the Red Army would be the dominant force, and the West would either wait or act too late. He knew his warnings would be forgotten, but in his heart, silence was impossible. History was unfolding, and Patton was determined to record every piece of evidence, every analysis, so that one day the world might realize the single opportunity to prevent disaster had already passed. The year 1945 ended with Patton feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had warned, but the world refused to listen. He had fought against time, politics, and the blindness of allies, knowing the consequences would last decades, and he was the only witness who had seen the truth that most chose to ignore.
In May 1945, the war in Europe officially came to an end. The guns on the front lines fell silent, German fortresses had collapsed, and American soldiers walked through towns that had once been blood-soaked battlefields. For many, it was a moment to celebrate, to breathe a sigh of relief after 4 years of devastation and loss. But for George S. Patton, there was nothing to celebrate. His eyes looked beyond the victory, straight into the future of Europe, and what he saw made him shiver. Patton walked through the streets of Bavaria, recently liberated from Nazi rule, but now under the presence of the Soviet Red Army. The scenes he witnessed weighed heavily on his heart. Red Army convoys carrying away entire factories, equipment, and assets no longer controlled by the Germans. Families forced from their homes, their belongings scattered across the streets. Men disappearing in the night, taken by the NKVD, never to return. Patton observed everything, committing every detail to memory. In his eyes, this was not liberation, it was a planned occupation. One afternoon, he accompanied officers on an inspection of a city that had once been a German industrial hub. On the deserted streets, they saw local workers coerced into labor under Red Army supervision. Factories were dismantled, machinery transported away, and all signs of normal life seemed erased. Patton turned to a young officer, his voice trembling yet resolute. "They are not liberating, they are seizing, and if we do not stop them now, all of Europe will live under this rule for decades." He began analyzing the latest intelligence reports. Despite being exhausted from the war, the Red Army was reinforcing its positions across Eastern Europe, consolidating control, showing no signs of retreat. Patton realized the only opportunity to push them back to the borders was nearly gone. "We are standing by, and they are building an empire," he told his officers. "If we do not act now, every opportunity will vanish forever." Patton relied not only on maps or reports. He traveled through towns, looking into the eyes of the people, hearing horrific first-hand accounts. In Poland, he saw remaining civilians trembling at the mention of arrests. In Czechoslovakia, he heard of local officials tortured or executed for refusing to cooperate with the Soviets.
all indicated a clear pattern. Every action of the Red Army aimed for total control, not national liberation. He called his officers into the meeting room, yellow light casting solemn shadows over their faces. On the map, he pointed to each territory recently occupied by the Red Army. Do you see it? They do not stop. They are laying the foundation for the future, and we are standing still. Every day that passes is a day we hand over power, Patton emphasized, his voice trembling but commanding. Patton understood that Western hesitation resulted from both political blindness and a desire for quick peace. Eisenhower and Western leaders believed diplomacy would secure order and stability. Patton saw differently. He saw the reality before him. The Red Army had not come to sign peace agreements, but to ensure absolute power, and every political accord was mere window dressing. One night, he sat in his office, maps spread wide, reports covering the desk. His hand shook as he traced each red arrow moving westward, highlighting the areas under Red Army control. Rain fell against the windows, the yellow light casting tense shadows on his face. He knew that if action was not taken immediately, the only chance to stop the Soviets would close. He murmured, "We are preparing for victory parades, while they are preparing to rule for decades." In the following days, Patton moved from Berlin to Bavaria, observing every act of Red Army occupation. He saw convoys transporting German property, local officials arrested and dealt with, families separated and forced from their homes. Each scene reinforced his conviction. The Red Army did not liberate, they replaced. Patton began recording everything, compiling detailed reports for Eisenhower, hoping that one day the world would recognize the truth. He knew these warnings would be forgotten in the political context of the time, but he could not remain silent. He understood that in these weeks, Europe was being shaped not by the power of the Allied armies, but by Stalin's strategy and ambition. Looking at the map, Patton clearly saw a future few wanted to acknowledge: a divided Europe, Eastern Europe under Soviet control, Germany split in two, and personal freedom severely restricted. He knew that what he saw would determine the fate of millions for decades. There was no doubt the war had ended, but the real conflict had only just begun. On May 31st, Patton convened his officers, voice trembling but resolute. "We have witnessed the rise of the Red Empire. If action is not taken now, Europe will pay with its freedom, its lives, and its hope, and we will never have a second chance." The room was silent, the men recognizing that his words were not idle talk, but prophecy grounded in battlefield reality. Patton knew he could not persuade Eisenhower to act. Politics had decided, and the military had to follow. Yet he continued to observe, recording every step of the Red Army, every sign of power consolidation. In his eyes, each captured village, each dismantled factory was proof of a looming disaster, a disaster the world would endure for decades. For Patton, this was the decisive moment, not on the battlefields of Germany or France, but on the political and ideological map of Europe. Every Red Army advance was a warning. If the West continued to hesitate, Europe's future would belong to Stalin. He looked at the map one last time, eyes cold but clear. "We have defeated Germany, but if we are not careful, the Soviet Union will defeat Europe, and the next generation will live in the darkness we could have prevented today." May 1945 ended with Patton standing before the map, hand trembling but eyes determined, staring into Europe's future, a future he knew would be filled with suffering if his warnings were ignored. And he understood that a new war, not against Germany, but against the Soviet Union, had quietly begun.
The summer of 1945 passed, but George S. Patton's mind remained restless.
The war in Europe was over, but for him, the real struggle had only just begun. Patton was no longer commanding armies on the main battlefields, yet his eyes followed every move of the Soviet Union, every sign of power consolidation in Eastern Europe, and every political decision being made by the West. Patton knew he had warned them, but his warnings were either forgotten or dismissed as extreme. While Eisenhower and other leaders believed that peace and diplomacy would ensure security, Patton saw a very different picture. A red empire forming, solid, unstoppable, ready to expand its power at any moment. He called these weeks the only moment to act, the sole opportunity to prevent a disaster before it spread across Europe. His field inspections from Bavaria to Berlin had seen it all. The Red Army occupying cities, seizing property, arresting local officials, forcing civilians to work, and establishing absolute authority over recently liberated territories. Every action followed a clear pattern, not liberation, but replacement. Patton knew the West was not ready to recognize this truth. At the end of July 1945, Patton was invited to a high-level conference in Berlin where Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met at Potsdam to redraw Europe's political map. He was not part of the formal sessions, but he observed enough to see Stalin dominate the meeting, maneuvering pieces skillfully, while Churchill appeared weary and Truman cautious. Patton realized a stark truth. The Soviet Union had acted first, placing the West in a reactive position rather than a decisive one. He wrote in his diary, "Stalin has completely outmaneuvered us. Europe is in their hands, and we are merely watching." Back in Bavaria, Patton held a final meeting with his officers. The dim light filtered into the conference room, cigar smoke curling along the ceiling. He stood before the map, speaking slowly but with authority. "The war we fought will be remembered, but the war we refuse to face will haunt the world far longer. We are allowing a new empire to rise, not based on promises or flags, but on absolute power, control over all Eastern Europe, soon to spread across the world. If we do not act now, we will pay the price." No one answered. Silence enveloped the room. The officers understood that Patton was no longer speaking of battles, but of political and power futures, a war they were not yet prepared to face. Patton continued to warn through urgent cables and private meetings with allies, yet it seemed no one truly listened. He knew that this refusal to act would create iron borders and ideological walls, obstacles that future generations would have to endure. And he also understood that time was slipping away, his influence was waning, political decisions had been made, and the decision-makers did not wish to alter their chosen course. On December 9, 1945, Patton suffered a tragic car accident, and 12 days later he died. To many, it was a personal tragedy, but to those who understood, his death seemed the end of a voice of warning, a man who had foreseen disaster and tried to prevent it. History, however, proved Patton right. What he had predicted about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe became reality. Nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania fell under Soviet domination. Germany was divided. Rigid borders, secret police, and political prisons became the norm. The Iron Curtain covered millions, restricting freedom and shaping regional politics for nearly half a century. When Winston Churchill spoke in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, he said, "An Iron Curtain has descended across Europe." Those who remembered Patton recognized this was not a new discovery. It was merely political confirmation of what Patton had foreseen through strategic vision, field observation, and military analysis. The Red Army had come not to liberate, but to seize. The following decades saw indirect conflicts, arms races, and ideological struggles, all the things Patton had warned of. The Cold War, from Berlin to Korea, from Cuba to Vietnam, was a direct consequence of ignoring his warnings. Patton had not only warned about the Soviet Union, but also about the nature of power and humanity's blindness when refusing to confront danger. He emphasized that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not what has already been defeated, but what is being ignored, latent threats the world chooses to overlook in favor of comfort, stability, and illusory peace. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Patton's prophetic legacy became clear. The iron borders, the constrained lives, the ideological struggles, all unfolded exactly as he had warned. He did not live to see it, but what happened was proof of the astonishing accuracy of his warnings in 1945. Today, military academies still study Patton's campaigns, not only for tactics or maneuvers, but to understand strategic vision, foresight, and sensitivity to emerging threats. Patton demonstrated that battlefield victories are never absolute if the world ignores greater challenges forming beyond sight. His legacy serves as a reminder: peace is not merely the absence of war, but the ability to perceive and prevent emerging dangers. The courageous and far-sighted, like Patton, may be isolated, but history eventually validates their insight. For Patton, victory was not just defeating an enemy, it was preventing a disaster before it occurred, and his warnings, from April to May 1945, became reality over the following half-century, proving that the most dangerous enemies are not those we defeat, but those we refuse to see.